Since October 7th's breakout of Gaza and the assault on the Zionist occupation by Palestinians, and since the genocidal onslaught that has followed, cracks in the foundation of the Zionist project are more visible now than ever. Multiple Israeli journalists, economists, and historians have predicted that the colony will not survive to its 100th year. All that is solid, or once seemed solid, is melting into air before our eyes, and it's a great thing. So the Ilan Pappé reading that we read goes through six reasons or like areas of evidence about this beginning of the end that he is seeing and that we're seeing too. And so I'm going to go and then we read another article that sort of supplements what he was saying. So I'm going to go through that basic structure. So those six things are the Israeli Jewish society, the Israeli economy, the international isolation of the Zionist entity, young Jews around the world, the Israeli military, and young Palestinians. So, all right, to start with Israeli Jewish society. Pappé says that the society has been fractured into two rival camps. And he says, quote, "The rift stems from the anomalies of defining Judaism as nationalism." And so these two rival camps, one is secular, mostly middle-class European Jews and their descendants. They've been instrumental in establishing the apartheid state in 1948, and they're committed to a pluralistic liberal democracy with one minor caveat: the exclusion of Palestinians. So that liberal democracy requires Palestinians' displacement and dispossession and genocide. And then on the other camp is the settlers of the occupied West Bank, or centered around them, the highly reactionary and influential electoral base of Netanyahu. They seek to renew the golden era of biblical kingdoms via a theocracy that stretches over the whole of historic Palestine, which again requires the displacement, dispossession, and genocide of Palestinians. So despite their common enemy, Palestinians, both are tied to that. These two camps have been clashing for years. After a brief pause after October 7th, that clash has resumed. More and more settlers are realizing that the apartheid state is unsustainable. 500,000 of the liberals have fled the country, leaving the colony engulfed by the most reactionary sections. It's a deeply sick society. Mobs of settlers recently broke into a detention facility and an army base to protest the arrest of soldiers who raped a Palestinian detainee, as one among an endless list of signs of that sickness. So the second factor or area to look at is the Israeli economy. One of the readings, I forget, actually, this is one of the articles that we read by Hever. And Hever says that no state on earth has been able to inflict so much damage to the Israeli economy as the state of Israel itself. There was a slump of almost 20% in the economy in the last quarter of 2023. 46,000 bankrupt businesses have gone bankrupt. Tourism has stopped. Israel's credit rating was lowered, and its bonds are sold at near junk bond prices. Foreign investment has already dropped, or had already dropped by 60% before October 7th, and shows no signs of recovery. Intel scuttled a $25 billion investment plan, which is the biggest BDS victory ever. And Israeli investment funds have been diverting their investments abroad because Israeli Jews don't want their pensions, insurance funds, and savings tied to the fate of the apartheid state. It's a real crisis of legitimacy. The Zionist entity also shows an increasing reliance on the U.S.'s extravagant financial aid, and that aid cannot reverse this trend. They've been hurt by economic sanctions, particularly by Turkey and Colombia. Colombia was Israel's biggest supplier of coal and has suspended shipments, jeopardizing Israel's ability to reliably power the nation and, in particular, its tech sector. Uh, International tech companies are closing their branches in the Zionist state or selling them for, pennies on the dollar. And thanks in part to the student intifada and the victory of BDS in general, joint research with universities abroad has declined. So these are really core features to the Israeli economy that are in decline here. So on the topic of international isolation, Israel is increasingly a pariah state. It's getting more and more difficult for them to defy international opinion and law. They've been condemned not only by billions of regular people around the world, but increasingly by ruling classes and their institutions, as indicated by the unprecedented rulings by the ICJ and the ICC. And on the topic of young Jews around the world, another factor in this beginning of the end, many have jettisoned their connection to Israel and to Zionism, if they had any at all. And many young Jews around the world have joined the Palestinian Solidarity Movement. They've decimated the ideological cover for the Zionist project by proclaiming that Zionism is not Judaism and that anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism. And that is heroic and historic work that will echo through time. And I believe I'm very grateful for that. On the topic of the Israeli military, the Zionist entity has been entirely reliant on the U.S. to fight Gaza's small guerrilla forces and to repel a merely symbolic retaliation by Iran. They are not the undefeatable force that they try to project. October 7th exposed their limitations. They really cannot defend the colony. The Israeli military is reliant on conscripts and reservists rather than a professional army of paid volunteers. Reservists outnumber full-time soldiers by 2 to 1. And they've now, just as of, I think, 2 months ago, begun drafting ultra-Orthodox Jewish men, which is, causing a huge internal stir. In general, the Israeli military has been totally unprepared for protracted conflict of the kind that it's seen in the last 9 months. This isn't a 6-day war. This isn't the 6-day war. They were organized around these sort of quick strikes and not this protracted conflict, which is really causing a lot of social stress, yeah, because of being reliant on reservists and whatnot. And they're very unprepared for a regional war, which seems to be on the horizon. And then the final factor that Pappé outlined, that I'm following his outline, is young Palestinians. And Pappé says that they're, quote, more united, organically connected, and clear about their prospects than the Palestinian political elite. They seek peace, not peace, but decolonization. They seek to establish a genuinely democratic organization to pursue a vision of emancipation beyond the two-state fake solution that's been foisted on Palestinians by the U.S. and by Zionism supporters, and has been accepted by the Palestinian Authority and Hamas. So they're looking beyond that. These other older forces, established forces, are to the right of the main movement. Pappé is careful to point out that a state's collapse is not always followed by a better alternative. he says that, quote, post-colonial realities do not always improve the colonial condition. And, we can in particular look at, well, what comes to my mind is South Africa, which saw the end of political apartheid, but the continuation of economic apartheid. And we obviously, our hopes and dreams for Palestine is to go beyond that. That's not going to be enough. So the end of the Zionist project has become foreseeable, more foreseeable than ever, and certainly in my lifetime. But U.S. support remains steadfast. Last week, the Biden regime released $3.5 billion to Israel to spend on U.S. arms. That was part of the $14 billion approved by Congress in April. And yesterday, it approved the sale of $20 billion worth of fighter jets and other military equipment. So that's a nice deal. The U.S. gives them some, $3.5 billion, and then they immediately receive it back, or the arms industry, the U.S. arms industry receives it back with this, as part of the $20 billion sale. That's how it works. So the end is foreseeable, but U.S. support remains steadfast, and the final years of settler colonies are marked by increased savagery. Haider Eid, a professor at Gaza's Al-Aqsa University, said, quote, "The more resistance the colonized indigenous population shows, the more brutal the colonizer becomes. Genocidal Israel is now walking in the footsteps of all other settler colonies on their deathbed." And so, yeah, we can point to South Africa, Algeria, Zimbabwe, Namibia, and many other examples. So what we want to see is the end of the inherently racist and genocidal Zionist entity and project. We want to see a single, democratic, secular Palestine from the river to the sea with equal rights for all. So how might it happen? Well, one, through the continued resistance of Palestinians in all its beautiful and necessary forms, the mass protests, the strikes, and the armed struggle. Two, more widespread and increasingly disruptive solidarity action around the world. Again, in all its beautiful necessary forms, including the military dimension, but particularly at the point of production, particularly work stoppages, refusal to ship weapons, workplace occupations, etc. But also includes BDS and the student intifadas that we saw last spring. We know there's no military, or there may be no military solution to Palestinian liberation, but there is also no solution that excludes the military dimension. I think that's important for us to remember. And so, particularly at the point of production, as I said, and also we need more solidarity, particularly in the Middle East and North Africa. That's going to be required. The PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, coined the famous slogan, quote, "The road to Jerusalem begins in Cairo, Damascus, and Amman." In other words, victory for Palestine is contingent on the success of the Arab masses in defeating the Arab regimes, the imperialism's junior partners. So, yeah, note I didn't cite any role for Israeli settlers. They won't abandon the Zionist project until it's on its dying breath. They're not part of the solution. And so ultimately, all of this must culminate in the end of imperialist sponsorship of the Zionist project. The Zionist project has always required international or imperialist support, first by the UK, then France, then the Soviet Union, and now the US and its partners in crime. As Jabra Nicola and Moish Makover said, these are two Israeli anti-Zionist Trotskyists, one Palestinian and Arab and the other Jewish. As they said in 1969, quote, as long as imperialism has a real stake in the Middle East, it is unlikely to withdraw its support for Zionism, its natural ally, and to permit its overthrow. It will defend it to the last drop of Arab oil. And Steve Lee, in a much more recent piece from a few months ago, who's here in this meeting, said, quote, supporters of Palestinian liberation cannot depend on the U.S. giving up its Zionist ally. It is more realistic to imagine the downfall of U.S. imperialism. This is why our strategy for anti-Zionism must be anti-imperialist. Only when U.S. imperialism is overthrown or so weakened that it cannot aid the Israeli state will Zionism end. So it's not just one block of imperialist powers that is to blame for carving up the globe, but the imperialist imperative to compete economically and militarily over portions of the globe that the capitalist system inevitably produces. It inevitably produces that imperative. So while fossil fuel reigns, the Middle East and thus the Zionist state will remain strategically important to one imperialism or another. We could see a future where the balance of global forces drastically changes and another imperial power like China takes over as the Zionist entity's main backer. It's not out of the question. So Palestinian liberation will require nothing less than regional and international socialist revolution to end this imperialist imperative that flows inevitably from capitalism. And it is to this international socialist revolution that we must devote ourselves and win the Palestinian solidarity movement to. Thanks, comrades.